All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. So what I'd like to do in the first part of the class is to just try to give you a map of the land of machine learning. I think it's good to get our bearings before we go exploring very deep. And then maybe in the second part we can have some Q&A, which is always fun. Think of it as everything you always wanted to know about machine learning but were afraid to ask. Okay. All right. Let me start with a very simple question. Where does knowledge come from? In the past, knowledge came from just three sources. Evolution, that's the knowledge that's encoded in your DNA. Experience, that's the knowledge that's encoded in your neurons. Culture, that's the knowledge that we acquire by talking with people and reading books and so on. And what is amazing in just the last decade is that a new source of knowledge has appeared on the planet, and that's computers. And notice that the appearance of each of these forms of knowledge acquisition was a major event in the development of life on Earth, right? Evolution is life itself. Experience is what distinguishes, learning from experience is what distinguishes, us mammals from, reptiles and insects. And culture is why humans are who we are and as successful as we are. And I believe that the emergence of knowledge discovered by computers is going to be every bit as momentous, every bit as big of a change as each of the previous three was, and it's just beginning. Notice also that each of these forms of knowledge discovery works orders of magnitude faster than the previous ones, and discovers orders of magnitude more knowledge. And the same thing will be true with computers. With computers, we can discover orders of magnitude more knowledge, orders of magnitude faster than through culture, than through experience, than through evolution. In fact, Ian LeCun, who's a famous machine learning researcher and these days the director of AI research at Facebook, says that most of the knowledge in the world in the future is going to be extracted by machines and will reside in machines. So knowing what this all means, I think, is very important for all of us as professionals and also as individuals and as citizens. So how do computers discover new knowledge? Well, that's what machine learning is all about. And there are 5 main ways. One way is to work in a way, the same way that scientists do. It's by automating the scientific method. We have our existing knowledge, and then we try to fill our gaps in that knowledge, and so on progressively. A very different one, very popular these days, is to emulate the brain. This is what deep learning, which you've probably heard of, is all about. Since the best learning system on Earth is the one inside your skull, what we engineers do when we're far behind is we reverse engineer the competition. So let's reverse engineer the brain and have learning algorithms based on that. Another one is to simulate evolution. Evolution is an amazing learning algorithm, right? It made you and me and all of life on Earth, so maybe we can simulate that on a computer and evolve the things that we want that way. Here's another one, and this is to realize that all knowledge that is acquired from data, which is what we're going to do, is necessarily uncertain. You're never really sure if it's right or wrong. So we need to quantify that uncertainty and then systematically reduce it. The principal way to do that is using probability, and that's what we'll do. And finally, there's reasoning by analogy. This is what we human beings do in our daily lives all the time, and there's a lot of psychological evidence to this, which is when you are faced with a new problem to solve, what you do is you consciously or unconsciously look for parallels with situations that you've been in before, and then you try to extrapolate from the old situation to the new one. And associated with each, so these are the 5 main paradigms of machine learning. And associated with each of them is a school of thought, what you might call a tribe, right? So there are 5 tribes in machine learning. And part of what makes machine learning, very fascinating, in addition to being very important these days, is that each of these tribes has its origins in a different field of science. And so, under the guise of studying machine learning, you can actually study all of these things and have a lot of fun. So the first tribe that we'll meet is the symbolists, and they have their origins in logic and philosophy. Now, each of these tribes also has a master algorithm, a learning algorithm that in principle is capable of discovering all knowledge from data. Every possible piece of knowledge can in principle be discovered from data by one of these algorithms. So the master algorithm of the symbolist is something called inverse deduction, and we'll see in just a little bit what that is. The connectionists, so-called because all knowledge in the brain is encoded in the connections between neurons, they of course have their origin in neuroscience. These are the ones who try to reverse engineer the brain, and their master algorithm is backpropagation. Okay. You probably have backpropagation in your pocket right now, doing speech recognition and various other things in your cell phone. Then the evolutionaries, they have their origins in evolutionary biology. Their master algorithm is genetic programming. We'll see what these are as well. The people who are, really focused on uncertainty, they're Bayesians because it's all based on Bayes' theorem. They have their origins in statistics, and their master algorithm is probabilistic inference. And then finally, the analogizers, they actually have their roots in a lot of different fields. They're actually the least cohesive of the 5 tribes. But probably the single most important influence in this type of machine learning is from psychology, because we have learned a lot from how people essentially reason by analogy. And their best-known algorithm is kernel machines, also known as support vector machines. So let's see briefly what they are, right? Just the key ideas and some of the major applications. So let's start with the symbolists. Here are some of the most prominent symbolists in the world. There's Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon, Steve Muggleton in the UK, and Russ Quinlan in Australia. And their master algorithm is inverse deduction. And inverse deduction is based on a really simple and yet very deep insight. And this is the idea that we can view induction as the inverse of deduction. Right? Machine learning is induction. It's going from specific facts to general rules. That is very poorly understood. What is very, very well understood is deduction, which is going from general rules to specific facts. Now, there's a distinguished, history in mathematics of figuring new things out by viewing them as the inverse of the things that we already know. For example, subtraction is the inverse of addition. And, integration is the inverse of differentiation, et cetera, et cetera. Addition, for instance, lets you answer questions like, if you add 2 and 2, what do you get? The answer is 4. It's not the deepest thing you'll hear in this class. Subtraction lets you answer the inverse question, which is, what do I need to add to 2 in order to get 4? And the answer, of course, is 2. Now, by analogy with that, deduction lets you answer questions like, if I know that Socrates is human and that humans are mortal, what can I infer from that? And what I can infer from that is that Socrates is mortal too. Now that's a piece of deduction. Induction is answering the inverse question, which is, if I know that Socrates is human, what else do I need to know in order to be able to infer that he's mortal? And the answer or unanswer is, of course, that humans are mortal. And I've just discovered a new general rule, and I can add that rule to my knowledge base, and then in the future I can combine that rule with who knows what other rules to answer questions that are potentially very different from the ones that I saw in the data. The symbolists are actually, of the 5 tribes, the only one that can learn this kind of highly composable knowledge, rules that I can then combine in all sorts of different ways to do different things. Okay, so this is very powerful. And of course, I wrote this in natural language, and computers don't understand natural language. What they use is something like, first-order logic. They use a formal language that is typically logic or some form of it. But the essential idea is the same. And as I said, this is a little bit like automating the scientific method, right? This is what scientists do, right? They look at data, they formulate hypotheses that generalize and explain the data, and then they do experiments to test those hypotheses and then refine them or throw them away and try new ones and so on. And in fact, one of the most exciting applications of this type of learning is precisely to automate science. So for example, the biologist in this picture is not the guy in the lab coat. The guy in the lab coat is actually a machine learning researcher by the name of Ross King. The biologist in the picture is this machine in the back here. This is actually what's doing the biology. Ross doesn't actually know a lot of biology, but doesn't need to. So this, the first machine of this kind was called Adam. This is the second one. It's called Eve, right? They're very imaginative with their names. And what Eve does is it starts with some basic knowledge of molecular biology, DNA, proteins, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's given something to study or some goal, like for example, study yeast metabolism. And then it looks at more data. It formulates hypotheses using inverse deduction to explain that data. and then it actually designs and carries out the experiments to test the hypothesis. That's actually what this is here. It uses sequencing and microarrays and whatnot to actually test the hypothesis, and keeps on going. So this is a complete scientist in a box. And a couple of years ago, Eve discovered a new malaria drug that is now in the trials. And once you have one robot scientist like this, there's nothing keeping you from making a million. And now, biology can make progress a million times faster, right? These scientists don't get tired, they don't get grumpy, they're not nasty to their grad students, right? So, very exciting. The connectionists, however, look at all of this and say, well, this is a little bit too abstract, too symbolic, too rigid, too clean. Learning in the real world doesn't work that way. Right? Most of the learning that we need to do, like learning to see and learning to, understand language and so on, is very different. And the example that we have of entities in the world that can do that is us, human beings. So if we wouldn't even be trying to do these things if we didn't know that human beings could do them. So let's take inspiration from them. In particular, let's look inside their brains, right? As I said, let's reverse engineer the competition. So the leader of this school is Jeff Hinton. He is a professor. He started out as a psychologist. These days, he's more of a computer scientist. He splits his time between the University of Toronto and Google. We're all getting hired by these companies at a very high rate. So Jeff was no exception. Jeff really believes that the way the brain learns can be encapsulated in a single algorithm. And he's been trying to discover that algorithm for 40 years. So he's tried longer and harder to do this than anybody else. In fact, he tells this story of coming home from work one day very excited and saying to his family, yes, I did it. I figured out how the brain works. And his daughter replied, oh, Dad, not again. So, he's the first one to admit that his quest has had its ups and downs, but it's starting to pay off. In particular, Jeff is one of the co-inventors of backpropagation, which is an algorithm that these days powers just about everything on Earth. Right? If you go to like Google or Microsoft or Facebook or whatnot, there's just backpropagation being used for one thing after another. And two other prominent connectionists are Yann LeCun and Yoshua Benja. So how are we going to do this? Well, what we want to do is build the simplest model that we can that will do our job, right? So we're going to be inspired by the biology, but our goal here is not to do biology, it's just to do machine learning. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to build the simplest model of a neuron that we can, right? So the brain, the nervous system is made of neurons. We're going to build a mathematical model of a neuron, and then we're going to build a big network out of those simple neurons, okay? So let's start with building a model of the neuron, which is in fact the easy part. A neuron is a very interesting kind of cell. In fact, it's a cell like no other. It looks like a miniature tree. So it has a trunk called the axon, and then it branches out, and the branches are called dendrites. And then these branches at the end of one neuron make contact with the roots of other neurons, which confusingly are also called dendrites. And the places where the outgoing and the incoming and the outgoing dendrites make contact is called a synapse. And what happens what happens is that neurons fire these electric discharges down their axons, called action potentials, which sends a bunch of charge from this neuron to the neurons downstream. And the neurons downstream, if enough charge, if enough current accumulates, they themselves will fire. So it's a null or none phenomenon called an action potential. And when two neurons fire together, if this neuron succeeds in making a neuron over here fire, then the strength of a connection between them goes up. Also known as Hebb's rule, or neurons that fire together wire together. And everything you know, everything you've ever learned is contained in the strengths of the connections between your neurons, in the strengths of the synapses. And which is why this whole school of machine learning is called connectionism. Okay? So how can we model this? Well, very simple. So here's the cell body. It does a weighted sum of its inputs. So the inputs could be the outputs of other neurons, or they could just be the retina. They could be pixels, right? So this could be the gray level in some pixel of a cat, of an image of a cat. Okay? And then, of course, each of these inputs has a weight. This weight is the strength of the synapse. So what we do is just the weighted sum of the inputs. And then if that weighted sum exceeds a threshold, then the output is 1, meaning the neuron is firing and it says, yes, I see a cat here. Okay? And by the way, there's at least one theory according to which you actually have neurons to identify specific things in the brain, right? There were these experiments done at UCLA where somebody found a Jennifer Aniston cell and like a Bill Clinton cell, and and who knows what went on between them. So this is the basic model of a neuron that we're going to use. And this has been known since the 50s. Okay, so this part is not that hard, and we know how to train those weights and so on. But a brain with one neuron can actually do that much. Actually, it's surprising how much it can do, but at the end of the day, right, a brain with one neuron is not, you can't even really call it a brain. So what happens when you have a big network with these days millions or even, billions of neurons? Now we have a very sticky problem, which is, here's the image of the cat, and the output should be 1, because it is a cat, but it's 0. So this little brain is doing the wrong thing. And now there's this big mass, this big spaghetti of weights, and how do I fix it? Right, this is known as the credit assignment problem. It's a very important problem in machine learning. Maybe it should be called the blame assignment problem, because it's really about deciding who to blame when things go wrong. Okay? And for a long time, people had no solution to this problem, and they despaired of the whole connectionist approach to machine learning. But then in the 80s, this backprop algorithm was invented. So what backpropagation does at heart is very, very simple. What it does is it goes to each of the weights in turn and says, if I slightly increase the weight, does my error at the output go down? Let's say that this should have been 1, but it's 0. If I tweak a weight here and it goes from 0 to 0.1, well, that's an improvement, right? We're getting closer to it being 1. So in essence, what backprop is doing is just this for each weight, and then tweaks until we can improve things. Now, of course, if you really had to do this one weight at a time in a network with billions of weights, you'd never be done. And so what backprop is a very clever way of doing this more efficiently. What it actually does is it first does that for the weights on the output layer. That's easy because that's just one neuron like what we already knew before. And then based on the results for this, it goes and figures out how to tweak the weights of the neurons in the previous layer. And then so on all the way back to the beginning. So what it does is it first computes the output. This is the forward pass, and then sees the difference between the real output, the actual output, and the desired one. That's the error signal. And then it keeps propagating the error back through the layers, which is why it's called error backpropagation, or backprop for short. And as I said, these days there's hardly anything that backprop isn't used for. Backprop is used, in the form of deep networks, for example, to choose what search results to show you when you do a search on Google or Bing, or to choose which ads to show you along with those search results, and to do image retrieval, like on Facebook when they tag images with the faces of your friends and whatnot, they're using backprop, etc., etc., etc. Speech recognition, like the Microsoft, the Skype translator. I don't know if you guys have used that. You can speak into it in one language and the person on the other end. Let's say you speak English and you're speaking to someone in China. They hear you speak Chinese, and then in return they speak Chinese and you hear them speak English in real time. This is powered by backprop. Okay? But the best known deep network is probably still the one that was on the front page of the New York Times a few years ago. It became known as the Google Cat Network. What the Google Cat Network did was watch hours and hours and hours of YouTube videos. So maybe it should be called the Couch Potato Network, because that's what it was. The journalists called it the Cat Network because the single thing that this network was able to recognize best was cats. And the reason for that is that there's more cats on YouTube than anything else, because people love to upload videos of their cats. See all the useful things you're learning today? But in addition to recognizing cats, it can recognize dogs and and people and so on. Okay, and at the time it was the largest network ever built. It had hundreds of millions of weights. These days there's actually much bigger ones. Now the evolutionaries they look at this and they say, well, sure, with backprop you can tweak the weights of the connections in the brain. Big deal. Where did that brain come from? Right? The brain was created by evolution. And evolution didn't just create the brain, it created, all of you and, all animals and plants on Earth. Now that's a learning algorithm, worth taking inspiration from. Okay? So this was John Holland's idea. He started working on this back in the late 50s, early 60s. And his idea was we know roughly how evolution works. So what we're going to do is we're going to simulate evolution on a computer. Except that instead of evolving animals and plants, we're going to evolve programs, electronic circuits, or whatever is that we want to have. Okay? And then two other prominent evolutionaries are John Koza and Hod Lipson. So John Holland called what he did genetic algorithms because they're algorithms inspired by genetics. And here's how a genetic algorithm works. At each point of the algorithm running, you have a population of individuals, just as in nature. And each individual is represented by a genome. In our case, the genome is a bunch of base pairs. In the case of computer programs, the genome can so there's 4 values, possible values at each position. But in our case, we're trying to evolve things like programs. They can just be bits. Right? So what we actually have here is maybe 1,000 bit strings. And in the beginning, they can just be random. Typically, you start out the generic algorithm with a bunch of completely random bit strings. And then what you do is so each of these encodes, some sort of program. Then you execute the program on the task that it's supposed to do. And then you measure how well they're doing. This measure is usually called the fitness value of the program, by analogy with evolution. So whoever does even slightly better at the task will get a higher fitness value. And then the individuals with the highest fitness get to reproduce. And the way they get to reproduce is literally by taking 2 parents, the mother and the father, and taking the genome of one all the way up to a random crossover point and then switching to the genome of the other. And that generates one child, just as in nature. Okay? And you generate a bunch of children this way, and then you also mutate them. Right? So mutations are basically bits being randomly flipped, just like mutation in biology. And then once you're done with that, you have a new population. So this goes on generation by generation. And the thing that's amazing is that you can actually evolve some pretty sophisticated things this way. In fact, the evolutionaries have accumulated a large number of patents from the US Patent Office for inventing devices like radios and amplifiers that actually work better than the ones that were designed by human engineers, although they're typically completely different, right? Because they're not thinking along the same lines that we do. So this is a surprisingly powerful way to learn. Now, John Koza's idea was that if what we want to do is evolve programs, then representing them as bit strings is a little too low level. Right? A program has a lot more structure than a bit string. And you could have a perfectly good program, and then and then you do crossover, you at some random point, and you destroy it. Okay? So maybe a better thing to do is actually to represent the programs as trees, because a program is really a tree of subroutine calls, subroutine, sub-subroutine, all the way down to simple things like additions and multiplications and whatnot. So, for example, if you had these 2 trees and you pick this crossover point, right, so what you do is at the crossover point, you take the subtrees and you swap them, okay? So after crossover, you would have one tree that is all the white nodes and another tree that is all the black nodes. And the tree with the white nodes is actually one of Kepler's laws. It's the law that gives the average duration of a planet's year as a function of its average distance from the sun. And this is something that a genetic algorithm can very easily learn. But it can also learn much, much more interesting things, like, for example, how to control a team of robot soccer players. So that was actually, I think that project was here at Berkeley, where they actually did that. And these days, the evolutionaries are having a lot of fun evolving not just programs or even electronic circuits anymore, but actual real hardware robots. This mechanical spider is actually a real spider from Hod Lipson's lab at Cornell. It actually crawls around and survives getting maimed and whatnot. And the way they do this is they start out with the robots in simulation. Once the simulated robots are doing well enough, they actually get 3D printed, and they come out into the real world. And then the spiders start to crawl, the dragonflies start to fly. They also have these robotic dragonflies that were evolved and a bunch of strange monsters. And whichever ones crawl fastest or farthest or whatever the fitness function is, they get to program the 3D printer to produce the next generation of robots. Okay? So this is both exciting and maybe a little scary. If Terminator ever comes to pass, then maybe this is how it'll happen. I mean, of course, these little spiders are not nowhere near ready to take over the world, but but they've come a long way from the random soup of parts that they started out as. The connectionists and the evolutionaries, they're very different at some level, but they also have something very important in common, which is they both take inspiration from biology, which maybe is not a bad idea. But actually, most machine learning researchers actually, they're a little skeptical about that. Their view is, well, biology, who knows? Biology is random. Just because something is inspired by biology doesn't mean it's good. And we want to do the best machine learning we can. So what we actually should do is figure out from first principles how to do machine learning optimally, and then derive our algorithms from that. And the Bayesians are probably the biggest exponents of that way of thinking, and to them, the fundamental principle on which all learning must be based is Bayes' theorem, which is why they're called Bayesians. Okay? In fact, the Bayesians believe that any learning algorithm that is not consistent with Bayes' theorem must be wrong. They're actually known as the most fanatical of all the machine learning tribes. And they have to be because for 200 years in statistics they were a persecuted minority, so they had to get very hardcore to survive. And and it's a good thing they did because they have a lot to contribute. And these days they're very much on the rise. So within computer science and AI, probably the best known Bayesian is Huda Pearl. He won the Turing Award, the Nobel Prize of Machine Learning, a few years ago for inventing something called Bayesian networks, which is a way to model the interactions among a very large number of variables very efficiently. And two other famous Bayesians are David Heckerman and Mike Jordan, right here at Berkeley. So what is Bayes' theorem? Bayes' theorem is, and you're probably familiar with, I assume that, how many people here are familiar with Bayes' theorem? Okay, so all right, so this is going to be just a very slight review and redirection of what you already know, right? So Bayes' theorem is something so simple, right, that you'll usually know like in week 1 or 2 of Stats 101, right? It barely merits being called a theorem, except that it's so important, okay? How do we use it in machine learning? And by the way, Bayesians love Bayes' theorem so much that one Bayesian learning startup even had a big neon sign of Bayes' theorem made and hung outside their office for the whole city to see. I think this was in London, right? So they had like a big neon sign of Bayes' theorem. Okay? And they also go lay flowers on Thomas Bayes' grave and whatnot. I'm not kidding.